This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The archives.
Episode 5. Trump won because trickle-down economics doesn't work.
Hello, I'm Phil Dobbie, and welcome once again to the Debunking Economics podcast, episode 5. Steve Keen is joining us in just a moment. And today we're talking about Trump, that unexpected win. It was unexpected, just like Brexit was. And was it for the same reason? A lot of disenfranchised people upset about the wealthy elite. Is it an acknowledgement that the trickle-down effect of some people being rich and then passing on their wealth and creating jobs for everybody else, that supposed trickle-down effect isn't working? We're going to talk about that on the Debunking Economics podcast today. Strange, really, isn't it, that if you believe that the massively rich are taking all the money and leaving the rest of us to struggle, if that's your concern, strange to elect somebody who is massively rich and doesn't pay any tax at all. Isn't he part of the problem? Well, not for Trump supporters, it seems, and there's certainly lots of them, as we've just discovered. And if you listen to our podcast on how Trump might have some of his ideas right, he just demonstrates them in a psychopathic, misogynistic, xenophobic way. And of course, this is the man who's going to have his finger on the nuclear button in January, so start digging that fallout bunker now. But his ideas of questioning free trade, cutting tax, perhaps writing off debt, some of those, as we explored a couple of episodes back, might not be bad ideas, possibly even good ideas. But does he have the personality to execute them in a way that's not actually going to cause more problems rather than fixing the problems we have? But let's look at the central issue here. Why did Trump win? Was it because he swept up the working class voters that in the past probably voted Democrat? Those old industrial towns where there are no longer jobs, those people disenfranchised with the establishment who they see the establishment as having money that they don't have. And of course that establishment includes Hillary Clinton, of course. The foreign workers also stealing their jobs. But you know, we've all had the argument used by conventional economists for a long time that it's okay to have wealthy people, because if the wealth creators are allowed to make money, that money will trickle down to the rest of the economy. They'll need workers. They'll employ those workers, and those workers will have money. Well, Professor Steve Keen is with us again. Look, Steve, if the wealthy do have this money, they have to do something with it. They're going to invest it. That investment is going to create jobs. What's wrong with that idea?
Well, actually, one of the funny ways it actually works is that Reagan swallowed what was called the Laffer curve, and I think there are a few more appropriately named people than Laffer, because I definitely laugh at everything he has to say. But Laffer literally drew the curve on a restaurant napkin, arguing there's some optimal level of tax, and arguing that the current level of tax in America was beyond the optimal level. So if we reduce the actual tax rate, he argued GDP would rise by more than the reduction in the percentage tax take, so that tax revenue would actually rise.
Yeah. And
by cutting taxes, you would actually increase government revenue and reduce the government deficit.
Now, we talked about that, and you said that was right. You agreed with that.
No, I didn't.
I thought, well, when we were talking about Donald Trump a few weeks back, and some of the good ideas, I said, you know, one of his ideas is cutting back tax, so you created more wealth, and you thought that was a smart move as far as Trump is concerned. The reason
being that since Trump won the election, if he actually carries out the promises he's talking about and cutting tax rates in the belief that it'll dramatically stimulate economic activity and actually help balance the government budget, what will actually happen, there'll be a massive stimulus from the government sector by cutting back on its tax revenue but still maintaining its spending level, and that will stimulate the economy that way. It certainly won't cause a balanced budget. The same thing happened under Reagan. Reagan had some of the largest deficits that have been run by the American government, except during times of economic crisis. And because of that spending, the economy actually got stimulated. So Trump will end up stimulating the economy for the same reason that Reagan did, not because the Laffer curve worked, but because the Laffer curve fallacy led to a much larger increase in government spending than the cut in government taxes, and that stimulated the economy.
So in the 60s, I mean, anyone earning over $400,000 a year in the US was taxed at a marginal rate of 91%. In the 80s, anyone over $215,000 was on 70%. Today, the top rate is less than 40%. So what you're saying is they had it wrong in those days? Because, I mean, surely they have more money. They have more money for government investment. That has to be a good thing, doesn't it?
Well, I'm not taxation. This is part of the problem about seeing taxation as an essential part of government revenue. They don't tax, they don't have any money. It's actually the other way around. The government creates money by spending. Yeah. It takes money out of the system by taxation. And some of the best arguments I've seen on this front actually by an ex-physicist called George Cooper. He used to actually be a Goldman Sachs quant. He's now running a bank in England. He's become a good friend, in fact. But George argues that what the taxation system did was stop money coagulating in the wealthy. Because if you have the wealthy earning the huge amount of money they do earn, and then they simply can't spend fast enough to get that money back into circulation. I've seen calculations that if you look at the age that Bill Gates is at, and imagine he was going to spend at the rate classical economic theory argues he does, and what they call the permanent income hypothesis. If he was going to spend the money he had now, he would self-combust in about 20 seconds. Okay, the sheer amount of the sheer heat he would generate by trying to spend the amount of money he's got now would cause him to explode. So they simply can't spend that quickly. And the role of taxation in that sense is to redistribute from where money coagulates in the circulation system and put it back into the hands of those who will spend.
Okay, so we don't need that money because the government can create the money anyway. But what it is doing is ensuring that there's some sort of balance. Because surely if you've got people who are earning an absolute mozza, they are going to buy big houses and push up house prices. They're going to push up the price of food or push up the price of almost anything because companies are going to say, well, we'll just sell to the rich people and forget about everybody else.
Yeah, but you still need, I mean, for the capitalist system to work well, everybody has to earn an income. Yeah. And if you start getting to the stage where there's no income being generated for the working class or the lower middle class, then there's no point investing for them either because they haven't got any money to spend in the first place. So a successful capitalist system has to provide everybody with a decent income. If it doesn't work, you get fascism. And this is the danger we're going through right now, that it's all very well for the wealthy to say we're going to concentrate the wealth ourselves, put the money in offshore accounts, etc., etc. It works until I think his name is Nick Hanauer, a Seattle-based capitalist who funded Amazon, has become quite a strident critic of the wealthy accumulating all this money. Capitalism only works so long as the poor don't get completely screwed. And if you get to the stage where the poor feel like they've got no stake in the system whatsoever, then as Nick Hanauer said, you watch out for the pitchfks.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the stage when you've got lots of money. Yeah. You're going to have to spend all that money in a gated community. You're going to have to just start hiring security guards to protect yourself. In effect, you're the feudal lords and the serfs are going to be out to get you.
Well, actually, I was in Manchester just a couple of days ago, and Manchester, of course, was the home of one Friedrich Engels, who was Marx's co-author in many ways, and was a wealthy German industrialist, but regarded himself as being on the run and a revolutionary at the same time. And we went to one of the pubs that he drank at, and the guide who took us there was explaining that it had not been for the girlfriend he had from the English working class, Mary, I've forgotten her last name, but Mary, somebody or other. If she hadn't been with him, he would have been probably physically killed by going to these pubs, because the level of resentment that the working class had of the wealthy at that stage was enormous, and partly because they'd also gone from being, in their own living lifetimes, they went from being peasants in a feudal estate to, with some decent living conditions, in fact, to landless labourers working in the dark satanic mills of early 1800s England, and resenting and hating the ruling class toffs, get them in a dark corner, they'd bash the hell out of them. So we have this tension in capitalism between the accumulation of wealth and the trying to avoid losing that wealth through taxation, and the sustainability of the society itself.
But at that stage, I mean, let's look at the Industrial Revolution, where you had a number of people who were very wealthy, the landowners who became the factory owners, who built the factories, built those terraced houses for all the factory workers. Some of them, were quite benevolent and provided.
There were,
and so I mean, that's an example of trickle down working, isn't it? If they hadn't have had the money and invested, those people wouldn't have had a job.
Well, capitalism really the basis of capitalism's success was the exploitation of the free energy. If we look at the growth of English capitalism, it only began when we started with the steam engine taking advantage of coal, initially actually to find ways to pump water out of coal mines. That was the way the steam engine was first actually invented, with an enormous increase in their capacity to turn physical resources into commodities was the source of that wealth. And capitalism certainly gave you the impetus to want to do that, because anybody who managed to overcome those problems became fabulously wealthy. So yes, that was part of it, but it's also a circulatory system. If it doesn't circulate as well, then you get this enormous disparity, and you end up with a form of feudalism coming out of it again. This is one of the remarkable things about Latin America, for example. I remember reading a remarkable book on the issue of the difference between the ruling class and working class in Latin America versus that in North America. And in North America, the USA, capitalist consumption is roughly 30% of GDP. In Latin America, it's roughly 70% of GDP. Now you look at it, and the ruling class in Latin America is trying to keep up with the living standards of the wealthy in America, and the only way they can do it by paying absolutely lousy wages, terrible conditions for their workers, and particularly in plantations, and that gives you a very stagnant society. So there is a balance between the two. And you can push it too far, as I think it certainly was done when you had marginal tax rates of 91% back in the 60s and 70s, as you were saying. You push it too far in the other direction, where you have almost no taxation at all, and the wealthy certainly managed to evade that tax, as we know Donald Trump quite successfully did for the last 2 decades, and consequently they accumulate all this wealth, and there's no way they can spend that fast enough to generate the level of economic turnover we saw back in the 50s and 60s in America, when being a working class American was a reason to be proud rather than to be angry.
So isn't that utility that word which is used a lot in economics? We only have money for the utility that we can make out of it. What's the value of that? Well, I was going to say, but I mean, that is the argument, isn't it? And but then from what you've said, I mean, that goes counter to that, doesn't it? Because I want all this money. It's of no use to me whatsoever, because I've got so much of the stuff I can't even spend it, but I still want more of it.
Immense use to you, because you can buy a bigger yacht than the bloke next to you.
Right.
And this is one of my favourite anecdotes about an Australian Ponzi scheme you and I know both well is, you think he was born in England originally, but he hasn't quite died yet, but that'll happen. The one, Alan Bond.
Mm.
I mean, Alan Bond was noted as a painter, in his own right, or a painter of walls rather than painter of paintings. But he became part of the art community and bought that classic still life by Van Gogh. And he was wandering through an art exhibition with his underlings one day, and he stood staring at some particular painting for some substantial period of time, and his underlings thought, maybe Alan's finally developing a bit of appreciation for culture, looking at a Van Gogh. And as he walked away from it, he said to all of them, "Mine's bigger."
Well, you can't. The thing is, you can't buy class, can you? That's the problem.
You can't buy class.
But
nonetheless, it's comparative stuff, and these people still want to accumulate more.
Right.
Larry Ellison, apparently, on the same story, wanted to buy a bigger yacht than Bill Gates had. I mean, so that even though you can't use more of the money, the comparative stuff still dominates how people behave. So there's no way in which people slow down when they get enormous amounts of wealth. You do get your exceptions like
Bill Gates,
Warren Buffett. Bill Gates took a while. Warren Buffett persuaded him. I'm never going to give Bill Gates first credit there. Warren Buffett definitely persuaded him to use his money for benevolent reasons.
Right.
So Warren Buffett is definitely the example of somebody who's lived a humble lifestyle throughout and intends giving away almost everything he's accumulated when he dies.
So if we had the right instruments to ensure, some sort of government policy to ensure that the rich invested rather than, amassing their money in tax havens or buying expensive yachts. Is what stops the trickle-down economy working? If we had the right measures to say, you can have all this money, but you've got to reinvest it, and it's got to be for a productive end, then that trickle-down theory would work, wouldn't it?
Well, the turnover theory of capitalism would work, and not so much trickle down as turnover. You have to force that money to circulate, and if you let it accumulate just in the wealthy, then the rate of circulation slows down and you have a slump in the economy. But it would be feasible to invert that by saying, okay, well, the wealthy are going to accumulate all this money by not paying their taxes. We'll just pay more in direct government payment to the poor and let this trickle up in that sense and cause inflation, which would then reduce the value of the money being accumulated by the capitalists, but still provide a decent level of cash for the workers. So there are other ways to attack it, and partly our problem is in seeing... But
that would be a cycle, wouldn't it? That would continually increase inflation.
It could, yeah, it could do, but that's the dilemma. We really, and this is where I think the work that George Cooper has done in arguing that a democratic system which taxes and transfers the money back to the working class and enables the money to circulate rather than coagulating is a good argument, a good interpretation of how we could think about capitalism. We have to maintain that circulation, and there's always a temptation for the wealthy in particular, who have got the capability to do it, to accumulate the money rather than spend it.
Right. And look, often when we hear the argument that we should be taxing the rich more, the argument is given, well, it's not actually going to create that much money for the economy. We might be talking millions, we're certainly not talking billions. But from what you're saying, that doesn't matter too much, because actually the only reason you want to tax the rich more is because you want to try and maintain this sense of balance where they're just not getting a preposterous amount of money, which is inflicting pain on the rest of the economy.
Yeah. It's not necessary to finance government spending, but it's necessary to stop the money slowing down and not circulating anymore, which of course is another issue we've talked about earlier.
So finally though, I mean, people still do talk about the effect of the trickle down. A lot of government policy still seems to be based on this idea. In fact, increasingly seems to be based on this idea of trickle down, even though there's no evidence that it actually exists or has ever existed.
No, it's much better to think in terms of gush up rather than trickle down.
Yeah.
Well, if you put money in hands of people who don't need to spend it, they're going to accumulate it. If you put it in hands of people who have to spend it, then it will be spent. So gush up is a much more effective economic model than trickle down.
Which gets down to that fundamental question, doesn't it, about economics? Is it actually that if you produce stuff, people will buy it and then that gets the economy moving? Or is it a question of if you give people money, then they'll want stuff and therefore it'll have to be produced?
Well, capitalism is a monetary system, and if you don't think about money, you're going to get capitalism wrong. And in an essential sense, that idea about trickle down was based on an ignorant notion about where money comes from and how it turns over. And trickle down, if you rely upon the spending of the wealthy for its own sake, they're spending for their own consumption needs, you're not going to get as much turnover occurring as if you pump the money into the bottom of the system where people have to spend. And that's, in many ways, that's the fundamental weakness of that logic. It won't trickle down to the people at the top don't need to spend it in the first place.
Yeah, well, look, it's going to be interesting to see, isn't it, whether Donald Trump embraces your gush-up theory. I'm not going to hold my breath because he's talked about tax cuts across the board for the rich as well as the poor. And from what you're saying now, tax cuts for the rich won't do much good because the benefit won't trickle down. But more money for lower income earners, and that money's going to be spent. That makes common sense. As always. Good to talk to you, Steve.
Okay, mate. Bye.
And next time, I think we said we were going to talk about this time, but of course the Trump victory surprised us all, and we did want to talk about that today. So next time we're back where we were. We're going to look at monopolies. Why do economists hate them so much? And are there ever times when monopolies can be a good thing? Join us for that next time on the Debunking Economics podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening. See you then.